Amelia Bedelia goes camping. Hurry up, Amelia Bedelia, called Mr. Rogers. I'm coming, said Amelia Bedelia. Did we get everything? Asked Mrs. Rogers. I would say so, said Amelia Bedelia. Good, said Mr. Rogers. It's time to hit the road. Hit the road? Hit the road는 이제 출발하자 이런 뜻이에요. Asked Amelia Bedelia. All right. She picked up a stick and Amelia Bedelia hit the road. Stop that, shouted Mr. Rogers. Get into the car. Amelia Bedelia got into the car. I'm so excited, she said. I've never been camping. You will have fun, said Mr. Rogers. They rode for a long time. Finally, Mr. Rogers stopped the car. Wake up, Amelia Bedelia, said Mrs. Rogers. This is it. Amelia Bedelia looked all around. But where's the camp? She asked. The camp is in the car, said Mr. Rogers. In the car? Said Amelia Bedelia. We are going to camp in the car? The things we need to make the camp are in the car, said Mr. Rogers. Make the camp? Said Amelia Bedelia. We have to make the camp? Just forget it, said Mr. Rogers. I'll put the tent here. We can pitch it later. All right, said Amelia Bedelia. Now let's have some fun, said Mr. Rogers. Let's catch some fish. I've never caught fish, said Amelia Bedelia. Is it like catching a ball? Mr. Rogers laughed. It's more fun, he said. I'll show you how. Did you bring any cookies? Asked Mrs. Rogers. Yes, said Miss Amelia Bedelia. I made up a new kind. Amelia Bedelia got the cookies. Chocolate, said Mr. Rogers. My favorite. He took a bite. They are so crunchy, he said. That's the potato chips, said Amelia Bedelia. I do love potato chips. I put in a whole bag. I call them chocolate chip cookies. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers looked at each other. Call them what you like, says Mrs. Rogers. Just make them often. Bring them along and follow me, said Mr. Rogers. Let's find a good fishing spot. They walked along the bank. After a bit, Mr. Rogers stopped. He looked at the water. This looks good, he said. Amelia Bedelia stopped. I see one. I see a fish, she said. I will catch it. Wait, said Mr. Rogers, but Mr. Rogers was too late. Amelia Bedelia was in the water. Here, fishy, she called. Then she grabbed the fish. I caught it, she yelled. What a big one, said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia looked at the fish. The fish looked at Amelia Bedelia. All right, said Amelia Bedelia. Away you go. The fish swam away. Amelia Bedelia, yelled Mr. Rogers. Why did you do that? Amelia Bedelia looked surprised. Why not? She said. You just said to catch a fish. I did that. Oh, go away, said Mr. Rogers. Thank you, said Amelia Bedelia. I'm wet. I do need to change. Amelia Bedelia started to leave. Oh, Amelia Bedelia, said Mrs. Rogers. Please start a fire in the grill. Use pine cones to start it, said Mr. Rogers. And put on some coffee. All right, said Amelia Bedelia. 불을 지펴서 거기에 커피를 끓이라는 말인데요. Amelia Bedelia walked to the car. She changed it into dry clothes. Now, said Amelia Bedelia, I'll surprise Mr. Rogers. I will pitch the tent. She walked over to the tent. Shoot, said Amelia Bedelia. I can't even lift it. Need some help? Said someone. Amelia Bedelia turned around. Who are you? She asked. I'm Harry, said one boy. I'm Mike, said the other boy. I'm Amelia Bedelia, said Amelia Bedelia. Amelia Bedelia, said Harry, we've heard about you. You have? Said Amelia Bedelia. That's nice. Now will you help me pitch this tent? Where do you want to pitch it? Asked Mike. The big thing is to pitch it, said Amelia Bedelia. It can come down where it wants to. The boys grinned at each other. Okay, let's do it, said Harry. They caught hold of the tent. They all picked it up. And they pitched that tent. Hooray, said Amelia Bedelia. We did it. Maybe we should pitch it again, said Mike. Why? Said Amelia Bedelia. It's in the bushes, said Harry. That's a good place for it, said Amelia Bedelia. It's out of the way. 아, 원래 pitch the tent는 텐트를 치라는 뜻인데 아멜리아 베델리가 이렇게 pitch는 던지다라는 뜻도 있어서 던져버렸어요. Hey, said Mike. Mom is calling us. Thank you for helping me, said Amelia Bedelia. She watched the boys go. I had better get that fire started, said Amelia Bedelia. She got some wood and pine cones. She put them in the grill. Live and learn, said Amelia Bedelia. I didn't know pine cones could start a fire. I want to see this. Amelia Bedelia sat down. She waited and waited, but the fire did not start. Suddenly she jumped up. The coffee, she said. I forgot to put on the coffee. She poured the coffee on the pine cones. 저기 커피를 다 쏟아버렸어. Now it should start, she said. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers walked up. Why isn't the fire burning? Asked Mrs. Rogers. The pine cones haven't started it yet, said Amelia Bedelia. Did you try using a match? Asked Mr. Rogers. match는 성냥이에요. You didn't tell me to do that, said Amelia Bedelia. Never mind, I will do it, said Mr. Rogers. You put on some coffee. I did, said Amelia Bedelia. Didn't I put on enough? Oh, go jump in the lake, said Mr. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia stamped her foot. I will not, she said. I have no more dry clothes. Mr. Rogers laughed. You win, he said. Can't you row a boat? Can you row a boat? Certainly, said Amelia Bedelia. Use any of the boats, said Mr. Rogers. Have fun. row a boat는 배를 이렇게 노를 저으면서 타라는 뜻인데 Amelia Bedelia found the boats. I'll just use all of them, she said. She pushed the boats this way and that. The boats were rowed. row는 한 줄이란 뜻도 있어서 이렇게 일렬로 선 다 맞춰버렸어요. Amelia Bedelia went back to Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. That was fun, she said. What is next? I need a 10 stakes. 10 stakes, said Mr. Rogers. I will get them, said Amelia Bedelia. She ran to the car. She brought back a package. Here, said Amelia Bedelia. Mr. Rogers opened the package. What in tarnation, he said. Didn't I cut them right? asked Amelia Bedelia. They look like tents to me. tent sticks라고 해서 텐트 모양의 sticks를 다 잘라왔어요. How am I going to pitch the tent? asked Mr. Rogers. Don't fret, said Amelia Bedelia. I pitched the tent. Mr. Rogers looked. Where is the tent? he asked. In the bushes, said Amelia Bedelia. Just where it landed. That does it, shouted Mr. Rogers. He stamped off. Mrs. Rogers went after him. Why is he so upset? asked Amelia Bedelia. I was just trying to help him. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers came back. It's all right, Amelia Bedelia, said Mrs. Rogers. We can sleep under the stars. I'll help you get the sleeping bags, said Mr. Rogers. I can do it, said Amelia Bedelia. She went to the car. Sleeping bags는 침낭인데 Amelia Bedelia came back slowly. She was carrying some bags. Shh, she whispered. I think they are sleeping. But how can you tell? 어떻게 알으셨죠? 이러는 거예요. 자고 있는, 가만히 있는 배를 가져왔어요. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers stared at Amelia Bedelia. Then Mrs. Rogers said, Never mind, Amelia Bedelia. I'll get this camp shipshape, said Mr. Rogers. That sounds like fun, said Amelia Bedelia. What kind of shipshape will we make? You have done enough, said Mr. Rogers. I will do this. Amelia Bedelia walked away. I don't know much about camping, she said, but I do know one thing. It's time to eat. Amelia Bedelia bustled around. She did this and that. Finally, she had everything ready. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, called Amelia Bedelia, it's time to eat. I'm sure ready, said Mrs. Rogers. She and Mr. Rogers came. Fried chicken, stuffed eggs, said Mr. Rogers. What a feast! All three ate and ate. Now I'm stuffed, said Mr. Rogers. There's one thing more. Oh, one more thing, said Amelia Bedelia. I'll go and get it. Soon she came back singing, Happy birthday to you. My birthday, said Mr. Rogers. I forgot my birthday. Blow out the candles, said Mrs. Rogers, and cut the cake. Mr. Rogers did just that. Then he said, Amelia Bedelia, this is the best camping trip ever. Amelia Bedelia smiled. Let's do it again, she said. I do love camping.